Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of Question Time with myself, Harry Knight. Once again, I'm going to be going through a few of the questions that you guys have left in the comments of previous videos and doing my best to provide some answers. Now, first question this episode comes from Eric Lanoue, who was asking a question about our functional stance that we teach, and in particular the idea that you want your leading hand to stay outside of your heel rail. So I'm goofy foot, so if I'm surfing towards you guys, that means that my right hand is going to stay out over the right rail, my heel rail, as I'm surfing. And this is a really fundamental part of surfing. When we get all the way up into level 4, there are some occasions where you'll see that leading arm cross over onto the toe side rail. But even for the majority of level 4 surfing, we're still really going to be keeping that leading hand over the heel rail. Now, Eric's question in particular was about forehand bottom turns and backside top turns, which are both toe side turns. And when we turn onto our toe side, there is an inclination for this arm to come across, especially anyone that's been taught to snowboard with the broomstick analogy and pointing the broomstick at where you want to go. I see that quite a lot. Now, the problem is when we're turning, when we're doing these carving turns, particularly through level 1, level 2, level 3, what we want to be doing is sitting weight onto the back foot to lift the nose out of the water to get the board turning. If we bring the shoulder, the leading shoulder, across the board, what it does is it naturally puts weight onto my front foot, which will result in the rail of the board catching and us falling off. Okay, so quite important, particularly through level 1, level 2, level 3, we really want to be keeping this arm over that rail and not letting it cross. As we move into level 4, like I say, there are some occasions where we do use a little bit of body chalk, but the trigger basically is if you've done a really vertical bottom turn and you're coming up and we're getting half the surfboard above the lip of the wave, that's an occasion where we might think about using some body rotation to help bring the board down. And actually in this instance, what we are trying to do is get the weight onto the front foot to help with the recovery after the turn. But that's getting ahead of ourselves a little bit. So Eric, hopefully to answer your question, when we're going for a forehand bottom turn, first trigger is as we're dropping down the wave, what you want to do is take your back arm. Okay, so for me, this is my left arm, and I'm going to bring it level with my front foot. I'm going to reach for the toes of my front foot. Okay, and that's my compression as I set up my bottom turn. Now that's going to keep the weight forward. It's going to help me engage that rail and drive through the turn. Now, depending on how aggressive we're being, the more aggressive we're being, the more we're going to want to bring our weight back through that turn, okay, and sit the weight onto the back foot. Eventually, if we're really trying to get vertical, we're trying to get the nose of the board up to kind of 12 o'clock, then we are actually going to want to bring the weight back, and you will see surfers pivoting their chest and their hips to get the board, the nose all the way up. Now, there are a lot of people who, in this instance, as they drive through that bottom turn, you'll see them flick their arms like this as they go up into the turn. Now, the problem is it sets us up really badly because now I'm trying to turn onto this way and I've got to re-rotate my whole body back in this direction. So much, much better. As I go through the turn, I am going to allow my hips and my shoulders to just rotate a little bit, but I'm going to keep this arm back over this rail as the board comes through and comes up the wave face, because that's going to leave my chest square to the lip of the wave, which is how I want it, because that's going to make it much easier to initiate the top turn. Okay, one of the most common errors that we see in people that are pushing, from level 3 into level 4 and they're starting to get more aggressive is they start to really, we call them flicked bottom turns, and it's where you do reach forward with that back arm, but then we just immediately flick through with the arm to try and get the board to turn. And although it works and it is functional, it's much harder to get the board vertical using that technique. It's much harder to create drive and power coming out of the bottom turn with that technique. And like I say, it sets us up really badly when we're trying to bring the board back around again. So yes, through that bottom turn, we want to keep that leading hand out nice and quiet, doesn't really do anything over the heel rail. Now the same is true, that the mechanics for that are actually the same as the mechanics for a nice carving toe side turn. Okay, as we go into that, again, we want to be reaching for the water with our back arm. We want our leading arm just nice and quiet, out of the way, not really doing anything too much. And if you find yourself, the nose of the rail of the board bogging a lot, there's a good chance that it's this arm coming across, because it's very intuitive. There's so much in surfing that is counterintuitive. So anyway, I hope that that is helpful. Okay, our next question comes from OGP, and I'm going to get this out of the way because I'm going to need my whiteboard for this. OGP is asking about the ladder. We've spoken about this before, this kind of ladder set of controls that we talk about sometimes in terms of carving turns on the board. So for those of you that haven't seen this before, let me just draw this quickly. Okay, so I have the outline of my surfboard here, okay? And when we're talking about carving controls, what we sometimes talk about is having a ladder a bit like this. Okay, so hopefully that's going to look familiar from a previous episode. So what we've got our gas pedal here. This is our acceleration. We've got stall. If we're anywhere within this triangle here, we're stalling, we're slowing the board down. Any weight out on the rails here, this is our trimming turn. And then to produce a really nice carving turn, what we're saying is that we want to balance how much we bring the weight onto our back foot versus how much we put the weight on the rail. So if I come back 5 out of 10, I want to go onto the rail 5 out of 10, and that will produce a nice coordinated carving turn. Okay, not that the board won't turn if we don't hit this sort of imaginary ladder, but it won't be as efficient as it could be. Now, OGP's question was, how does this ladder relate when comparing what we call an outline turn versus what we call a rocker turn? Okay, and again, this is something I think I've very loosely referred to before. We've certainly spoken about it on the podcast in the past. Now, this is the idea when you start turning, when you start any turn, but also, when we're earlier in our career and we're just doing gentle turns, what we basically do is we keep the board fairly flat. We're maybe only coming onto the rail, maybe 4 or 5 out of 10 maximum. Okay. With these turns, the outline curve here, the curve through the back half of the board, okay, the way that the water flows and releases from this curve affects how the board rolls from rail to rail, how it initiates, and actually the turning circle that the board describes when we're doing that turn. Now, as we get better with our surfing and we start to lean the board over more, we actually use a different curve to do that turn. We use the rocker. Okay, so there's my surfboard. So basically what happens is as we lean the board over, the best analogy I have for you is aeroplanes flying. It works for me because I'm an aviation geek, but when you turn an aeroplane, you've got a couple of different controls. You've got the vertical stabilizer at the back, and you've got a rudder on that, and that makes the plane yaw from side to side like this. And you've got the elevators that make the plane pitch up and down. Now, if you're doing nice gentle turns, we use the rudder and we go around nice and slowly. If you are a fighter pilot, what you might well do is just lean the board over 90 degrees and then use the elevators to pull up around the corner. Okay. Now, with surfing, when we bank the board over more than about 45 degrees, the rocker, the curve of the rocker here, which we have been using to just stop the board from nosediving, okay, suddenly this curve is actually what's drawing the board through the turn, okay? The more that we put the board on rail, the more the control of that turn, the radius of the turn is controlled from the outline to the rocker, the more that we bank the board over. But the same as with an aeroplane, in order to do a good turn with an aeroplane, what we actually have to do is balance all three controls, the up, down, the left, right, and the roll, and we have to do this lovely coordinated turn, whether we're doing a gentle airliner turn or a fighter pilot turn. And the same is true for a surfboard, whether we're doing a very, very gentle, 1 out of 10 back, 1 out of 10 on the rail, really gentle kind of first experimental turns in the whitewater, or we're a really, really good surfer and we're coming 10 out of 10, big banked over carving turn. We still want it to be a nice coordinated turn. We want to use this ladder. Okay. Now there is a third type of turn, which we would normally refer to as being a rail turn. Okay, and this is what you'll see. Really, very, very good surfers. You've got to be a very, very solid, top end of level 4 into pro level before we're really doing these properly. And that's where they will come into a turn and they will just bank it over with all their weight on their front foot, bury the rail into the wave and power through this big turn, normally throwing tons and tons of spray. They are beautiful turns to watch. Now, the tricky part is, on this diagram, they're basically putting their weight here. Okay, and it's what we would call a trimming turn. And for anyone that's familiar with what we're doing, generally what we'd say is if we try to do a big change of direction by pressing here, what we're going to do is we're going to bog rail and we're going to fall off. Now, these guys, these elite level surfers are able to do this for 2 reasons. Number one is they are hyper aware of the feel of the board. I guess a good analogy would be if you're driving your car on slightly wet, icy, slippery road surface, okay? As you go into that corner, you feel the tires just starting to judder. You can just feel that board slipping. Well, these guys are so hyper aware of that as they bank in, they can really feel when that rail is about to grab. Now, the reason that the rail doesn't grab immediately is the second reason is they go into these turns so fast. They go into them at absolute maximum speed, and speeds that again are maybe only achievable by people at that level that really understand how to use the board and use the wave to get every ounce of energy out of it. Now, the reason that it works is as they bank the board over, normally we use this flat planing surface to generate lift to support our weight, but any surface can generate lift with enough flow. And as they bank the board over, basically this whole rail, the surface area of the rail, they're using that to generate lift to support their weight through the turn. Now, if they go in too slowly or the speed starts to drop off, then they're going to have to modify the turn. They're going to have to go from doing a rail turn, they're going to have to bring their weight back closer to the ladder and turning it more into a more coordinated carving turn. But most of the time when these guys get it right, they can keep the weight on there, power through with all of that speed, and then straighten out and come back onto the flat planing surface to ride out and stop the board from bogging in. So yeah, that's quite a detailed explanation of those 3 different turns. Hopefully that answered your question about that. There was one other question about this triangle which came from Jamie MacMahan, and he was asking whether this ladder changes shape with the board. And the answer is yes. If the board's got a very wide tail, then yes, obviously this ladder will become wider. If it's a narrow-tailed board, it'll become narrow. It's why you'll see, again, really, really good surfers, if they're riding wide-tailed boards, they'll often actually move their foot to the left or the right. They'll move their back foot around to get the best control. The other thing I will say is this is not an empirical digital ladder that exists on the deck of your board. This is the best analogy I have for explaining the mechanics of doing a really good carving turn. The reality is that all of the controls of the board, it's a very smooth, fluid, analog thing where we're trying to balance what we're doing with what the wave is doing. That's where so much of the skill in making things look easy and beautiful comes from. Cool. Let's get rid of this then. Okay, so the next question comes from Lorenzo Bello, who was asking how outline affects paddling. If you took 2 boards that were both about the same volume but with different outlines, how would their paddling be different? Now we've touched on this very briefly in the past, but just quickly let me draw this in. Okay, as you can see, drawing is not my speciality. But let's say we've got these two boards, one of them quite skinny and narrow, one of them with a big round nose. But let's say that somehow we were able to keep the volumes about the same on both of them. Now, interestingly, there's an urban myth that if you have more volume in the front half of the board, that it will paddle faster. Now, this was actually, there's an experiment that the guys at California State University did a few years ago. I'll put a link to the paper on this down below. But they found that they basically took 3 identical surfboards. They moved the wide point and the thickest point in the floor. They moved that forwards and backwards a little bit. And they put people into a flow pool and had them paddle. And they found that it made 0 difference. All that happened was the surfers moved themselves forwards and backwards on the board to compensate to keep the board flat. Okay, so in that respect, the outline doesn't affect the paddling. However, now this is my hypothesis. I don't have any evidence for this, and I'm really hoping to persuade someone to run this study one day. My hypothesis is this, that as we paddle and the board is in displacement mode and it's just pushing water aside, this board here is going to have more frontal drag, okay, than this board here. So initially it might just be a little bit slower, but it's going to be quite marginal because as you're lying on this board with its smaller nose, you know, we've probably got our chest in the water as well, so that may well cancel out. But what is going to happen is as the boards start to pick up speed, and in particular as the wave lifts that tail and we're getting to the point where the board's trying to lift up and start skimming over the water and start planing, we are using this surface area here, okay, to try to lift the weight of our chest that's lying on the board to try and get the board to lift up and start skimming across the water and start planing. And my hypothesis is that boards that have a little bit more surface area, not volume, but surface area in the front half, will probably lift up and start planing just a little bit earlier than a board with a narrower nose. Okay. Now we've also got to take into account rocker. You know, flatter rockers are going to paddle quicker, steeper rockers are going to paddle slower. So there's lots and lots of other variables that we have to think about. But that's the hypothesis that I would love to test, to get 3 boards that are more or less the same volume, but with the wide point pushed forwards or backwards, and see if we can measure the speed that they actually start planing on. So again, if anyone would like to run that experiment and let me know how that goes, I would love to hear the results. But yeah, hopefully that answers your question, Lorenzo, about that. Just on the subject of paddling as well, there's been quite a few people have reached out with questions about paddling. What I will say is, if anyone has questions about paddling, look up Rob Case. I will put links to him down below. Rob is kind of the man when it comes to paddling. He's come down here, he's trained all of our coaches because he really is the world expert in what he does, and we didn't want to teach stuff that was different to what he was teaching. So yeah, check out his YouTube channel. There is nothing that I can talk about and explain that he won't explain better and in more detail. So yeah, those of you guys that have reached out recently with paddling questions, that's why I haven't addressed any of them. So yeah, check out Rob. All right, for me, for this week, that is all I've got for you. I hope that was an interesting discussion as always, and I hope you will join me again next week for more questions. For now, take care and have a lovely week. Bye-bye.